Welcome, everyone, to the January 17th, 2025 Condition of the Podcast episode of On Iowa Politics. This week on the show, the legislative session opens and Governor Reynolds delivers her Condition of the State address. State lawmakers consider a casino moratorium, and Joni Ernst has made up her mind on Pete Hegseth. Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Murphy, the Des Moines Bureau Chief for the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, and I come to you today to tell you that the state of the On Iowa Politics podcast is strong as it's ever been. With me this week are Gazette Deputy Bureau Chief Tom Barton. Hello, Tom.
Howdy.
We have Lead Des Moines Bureau Chief Marchel Hoff with us. Hello, Maya.
Hey.
Jared McNett of the Sioux City Journal is here. Hello, Jared.
Rest in peace to the immortal David Lynch, maker of the finest Iowa film, which is none other than The Straight Story. Everyone would be better off for having seen that movie.
I've actually not heard of that one. I'm going to have to check that out now.
Wonderful film.
All right. And finally with us is Gazette columnist Todd Dorman. Hello, Todd.
Hey, and don't forget, I don't want to make Erin get misty, but we lost Bob Euchre.
Yeah, it's been a heck of a day, and I appreciate that because it wouldn't be too hard to get me misty thinking about that one. We were talking about it a little bit before coming on the air here, so to speak, and I said Uke, that's one that's that was coming down to train tracks. Was in his advanced years and had been battling some health issues, but it still stinks when it hits you. I said on the social media, summer in Wisconsin will never be the same, without a doubt. So we miss you, Uke, and we hope you're in the front row. All right, first up this week, Governor Kim Reynolds on Tuesday night delivered her 8th Condition of the State address to a joint session of the Iowa legislature. The state's version of the State of the Union address. This annual speech gives the governor an opportunity to celebrate triumphs of the past year and unveil priorities for the coming year. This is a big enough one to justify one of our classic around the horn discussions here. So let's hear a little bit something from everyone on the podcast to give us a one thing or two that stood out to you from Reynolds' address. And Maya, we'll start with you. You were in the House chambers, just literally a few feet to the governor's right. You helped Tom write our team's main story, and this was your first Iowa Condition of the State address. What stood out to you?
Yeah, you're right, Erin. It was my first Condition of the State, not only because I just got here, but also I've gone to State of the State addresses, but this is very uniquely named the Condition of the State. So that's kind
right.
of fun. A lot of things stood out to me. I'm sure there are a couple things that stood out to you all as well. One of the things that I talked about last week was cell phone bans. Mm-hmm. In our conversation last week, we kind of were talking about whether it would be a full-on ban or whether it would look like recommending or having school districts just create a policy, whether or not it was a ban or just saying something on cell phones in classrooms. And so, that was really interesting to see. And it seems like lawmakers are in agreement with it. They think that, the floor that she set is having cell phone bans, at least in classrooms during instructional time. That's the floor. That's kind of what all school districts have to implement. And then they can go from there with what else they want to do, how they want to look at that. And the State Department of Education will also be putting out guidelines or sample policies for however schools want to follow that. So I thought that was really interesting that she went for the straight up ban.
Yeah, absolutely interesting. And it's going to be interesting to hear the discussion of that bill as it works through the legislative processes, and are schools comfortable with what she put forward? Do they feel it went a little too far? I'm looking forward to that. Jared, whether because you caught the remarks live and we won't make you say on there one way or the other, or because you followed our excellent team coverage, anything jump off the page to you?
Well, I also have the cell phone ban down in my notes. And I was thinking about it because, some of the other stuff that was in there, the childcare and, taxes, we've heard those things more than a few times before. The cell phone ban is a little more recent, and so a little more novel to me. And I know that the story that Maya and Tom did noted that a number of schools, including the Sioux City School District, have already implemented restrictions on cell phone use. Something that's been interesting with that to me is I know folks from our district have balked at the idea of a top-down approach to the problem. That came up last fall with the school superintendent saying that he thinks districts should just handle the issue themselves. Sioux City's already had a policy since 2022, 2023 school year. And it came up again when we had a legislative forum in December with area legislators and educators, and the educators were none too happy about the idea of a top-down approach to this. So I'll be interested to see how these educators, school officials, kind of lobby their representatives and senators to kind of see what shape this legislation ultimately takes.
Yeah, that's great stuff. Those are great examples, Jared. That's perfect. And like I said, exactly why I'm curious to see where this goes. And as you described that, it made me remember, and forgive me, I won't be able to remember the names off the top of my head. If I would have known I was going to mention them, I would have looked them up. But on a somewhat recentish Iowa press from this past summer, fall period, we had some educators, superintendents on, and this was one of the topics that we broached, having heard at that point that something like this may be possible, and they said something very similar. Right? That's a great conversation. Just please, not a one-size-fits-all approach. Let's leave this to the schools. So.
Yeah, and I know like one issue that like got kicked around a lot when I covered the forum back in December is, okay, if this is a top-down kind of thing from the state that's being set, and it's policy that the districts need to follow, how are like punishments for this going to work? Like, is it just a school infraction? They were really like honing in on that and what form that part of it takes when you're not in compliance with whatever it is that comes out of this.
Another great question that we'll be watching for when the actual bill is filed. Yeah. Good stuff. Sarah Watson of the Quad City Times is next. And Sarah, I'm going to defend you a little bit here for people who noticed that you slid into our DMs late here. We kind of had a jumbled start to the podcast recording this week. The timing was off just a little bit, and it sounded like Sarah got caught on the phone. So Sarah's tardiness is not going to be held against her.
Yes, I do apologize. Was on the phone, and but I'm here now.
No worries. So what is, Sarah, between what you heard from the governor or saw from our coverage, was there anything that from the condition of the state, addressed that stood out to you?
Yeah, I thought overall, I was in the past couple of sessions, there's been like a really big ticket item that's been, maybe controversial, like education savings accounts or vouchers, if you're opposed to them. And the area education agencies was the big thing, kind of almost a surprise, like just a really big ticket item. And it didn't seem like there was a similar big ticket item in her speech this time. She had a lot of, it seemed like, smaller initiatives that would probably gain more bipartisan support. So, for example, cancer rates in Iowa, that's something that Democrats had talked about a lot on the campaign trail. And obviously it's hit kind of close to home for Republican leaders in the state, with Kim Reynolds' husband, the first gentleman, having cancer, and the Senate Majority Leader having cancer. Hearing her talk about a task force to study the reason for Iowa's high rates of cancer, or rising rates of cancer. And so I thought that was interesting. And I also thought that her announcement of a task force to look at nuclear energy was also interesting, considering that Iowa's only nuclear energy plant at Duane Arnold's has was decommissioned. And so I thought that was interesting, especially given, the rise of AI and across the country in the last couple years, and data centers in Cedar Rapids and Davenport being proposed, looking at new energy options and technological advancements in nuclear. I thought was really interesting. And obviously there won't be a nuclear plant tomorrow or this year, but taking a look at those energy options for Iowa's portfolio, I thought was interesting. And the final thing, if anybody had told me that the governor of the state of Iowa would make a Doge reference in the regal halls of the Capitol, like a year or two ago, I wouldn't have believed you. So,
Oh man,
those were a few things that stood out to me.
Yeah, those are good, and I think you nailed it on the kind of the overarching tone of the address and of a lot of the issues she raised. I heard that a lot, Sarah. Tom, let's come to you next. You were also in the building, took the lead on our story. Is there anything that stood out to you that hasn't been covered yet? And if it's all been taken, I'll give you an out and let you take something from the legislative leaders' opening day remarks too, if you'd like.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody's done a good job of kind of summing up the kind of key takeaways and surprises from the governor's condition of the state address. I think Sarah really provided a great kind of overall summary of the condition of the state. One thing that did really stand out to me, though, was that for the first time, we saw the governor publicly press lawmakers to pass a hands-free driving bill. Up until this point, we really haven't seen the governor really weigh in on that policy debate. A hands-free driving bill has been introduced in the Iowa legislature going back to, I think, 2019. It passed the Senate only to get held up in the House, where you have kind of a more libertarian wing of House Republicans who are opposed to a hands-free driving bill, who, see it as a infringement of individual rights, in that they feel that they shouldn't be focusing just solely on, I guess, cell phone use. That any bill that's crafted should look at curbing distracted driving more broadly or more generally. And anyway, I spoke to Representative David Young, who is now the chair of the House Transportation Committee, where that bill we would expect would get run through. And talking to him after the condition of the state, he was among the many lawmakers who applauded the governor when she said that. I'd have to go back and check my notes, but I think she got a standing ovation, or I think lawmakers stood up to applaud that. And it seemed to be pretty bipartisan. And there was a fair number of Republicans to stand up and clap the governor or applaud the governor for recommending that, or pressing lawmakers to pass that legislation. And afterwards, he said that he took that as a good sign or a good indication that he felt that this year they will finally get that done, that the House will finally get a hands-free driving bill passed. He said that is also a priority of his, that he wants to finally see legislation get through that chamber and get on the governor's desk and get signed. And so, and we also heard from House Speaker Pat Grassley afterwards. We asked him about, the governor listing that as a priority and kind of putting some pressure on lawmakers to do that. He also, seemed to think that the fact that the governor was weighing in, means that there's increased chance or likelihood that will finally get done this year. Obviously, and I don't know, it's kind of a cliche, but the speaker said the devils will be in the details. It'll determine on what type of legislation we see, if that's going to be a repeat of the bill that the Senate passed that in years past, including last year, kind of gave some or enough House Republicans heartburn to not get that through. So that'll be interesting. There was one other thing. And maybe this is kind of infringing on maybe what you were going to say, Erin, but you wrote about the proposed budget from the governor. And, one of the things that kind of stood out is that, there weren't any real big kind of spending packages proposed there. We didn't really see any big, big ticket dollar items in terms of new spending proposed for the coming fiscal year. The governor and Republicans will probably say that, that's that it's intentional, that it's part of, their overall plan to try and keep government spending levels down, given the tax cuts that they recently passed and just took effect this year with the new 3.8% flat income tax rate, and wanting to make sure that that's sustainable, and so that they keep a close eye on spending. Democrats are going to argue that we didn't see any big ticket spending items proposed in the governor's budget out of necessity, that the state really can't afford to have any more investments or significant investments in things like affordable housing or childcare or healthcare, because the state simply can't afford to do that because of kind of the restrictions they've placed on themselves with those new income tax cuts.
Yep, those are two good ones. Just to tag on the hands-free driving one, and Tom and Maya have heard this already because we talked about it that night. I was doing Iowa press coverage duties with Kay Henderson, and that was the literal only moment during the governor's remarks where we turned and looked at each other at the same time with really surprised faces. And it wasn't because it's some giant policy or something. It's because, like Tom said, this thing's been around, basically, that the texting while driving ban was passed in 2019, and 5 seconds after that bill was signed into law, public safety and law enforcement have been asking for a hands-free law because they say that the texting while driving is almost impossible to enforce. So that bill, that proposal has been around for those 5 or 6 years with varying degrees of success. The governor's really never really weighed in on it. I don't even know if I could have told you before Tuesday night how she felt about it, whether she supported it or not. So for her to not only throw her support behind it, but to bring it up during condition of the state, I mean, that is a classic definition of using the bully pulpit. So it's going to be interesting to see if that's enough to get it. It's still not a guarantee. So we'll see if it's enough to get across the finish line in the House this year. All right, Todd, 4 people have gone before you. Did we leave any crumbs left for you to talk about?
Well, yeah, I share the view that, when you cut taxes $24 billion, you're not, at some point, you're not going to be able to do a lot. She not only the state investments were small, but she's depending on federal money for a whole bunch of these. Like, you've got the
and the reserve accounts.
Yeah, you got the $150 million effort to create new residency beds at teaching hospitals. That's going to be federal money. So, yeah, that's interesting. And I thought it was somewhat interesting. It looks like she's just going to let the legislature on its own, as far as property tax and higher education is concerned. She didn't have anything to say about either of those. We know the legislature is going to try to do quite a bit, and so I guess she is going to just let them do it. It's kind of, maybe you could call that hands-free governing. I don't know. It's legal as far as I know, but yeah. So those were a couple of things that stood out. We're going to see a lot of conditions of the state speeches like this in the future that are sort of nibbles at problems rather than giant initiatives, because the money is just not going to be there.
Yeah. I would just add to that, Todd, that a lot of people were wondering whether the governor was going to propose anything on property taxes, considering that is listed as the top priority for House and Senate Republicans. And so it was noticeable that the governor didn't present a specific property tax proposal At the same time, I guess it maybe wasn't surprising just because of how complex and complicated the state's property tax system is. And, putting forward any proposal or proposals is going to be incredibly tricky. We've seen this governor in the past, put forward a lot of proposals to provide tax relief. But as we mentioned earlier, a lot of that is kind of focused on the income tax side of things, which is a little bit, I guess, more straightforward and is a little easier to navigate and to put something forward without, creating a lot of potential unintended consequences, especially when you're talking about the impacts that this is going to have for local governments, for cities, counties, school districts, other taxing entities in the state.
Yeah, well, and you also have two guys in the legislature as the chairs of that tax committee, in Dan Dawson and Bobby Kaufman, who are super passionate about the topic and would have been bringing their own bills regardless of whether the governor introduced one or not. So that might have been part of the calculus too, is, look, I can put out a plan, but I know those two are going to have one too. So what's the point? And obviously, at the end of the day, the governor's office has to be part of the negotiations because she's got to be willing to sign off on whatever they sent them. But I do still think that is a really good one, Todd, and I'm glad you mentioned it. It absolutely still was noteworthy that she didn't make any proposal or really any mention at all, to my recollection, about the issue.
I mean, there was a brief mention of the issue, but she tied it to creating the DOGE task force and talking about how having that task force to present recommendations for making state and local government leaner, more efficient. That's going to be key when we're looking at property tax cuts. Yep,
that's right. That's right. All right, lots of stuff for us to follow throughout the marathon that is the Iowa legislative session. We move on from the opening ceremonies, but we're going to stay in the Iowa legislature. We learned that this coming week, we likely will get a subcommittee hearing on legislation that would reinstitute the state's moratorium on new casinos. A previous moratorium expired last year, and the Cedar Rapids group, in the meantime, has been hoping to get a new casino license from the Iowa Racing and Gaming Commission, the state regulating body. Tom, you talked to one key legislator for sure this week, and it sounds like House Republicans are planning on bringing back a bill very similar to the one that they passed out of the House very late in last year's session. That one died in the literal final moments of last year's session. What's your sense of whether House Republicans have any more optimism that the Senate will pass that one this year?
I mean, I think that's still an open question, and I think that we still don't know. As you mentioned, I talked to Representative Bobby Kaufman, who is the chair of the House Tax Policy Ways and Means Committee. He was the one that floor managed the bill last year that passed the House in the waning early morning hours of the end of the session, only to get stuck in the Senate. Well, I guess the Senate never took it up because it got passed so late, and it was the very, very end of the session. So we'll see. He did say that he planned on, I haven't checked, but last I talked to him, he said that he was planning on filing the bill today. I don't know if it's dropped or not. And that
today being Thursday by afternoon, by the way. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah. And that his intention is to have a subcommittee hearing on that bill early next week. Lawmakers are off Monday because of MLK Day. It's a state and federal holiday, but thought that they would have a subcommittee on that either Tuesday or Wednesday. I also had a chance to talk to Senate President Amy Sinclair to ask her that question about, what the prospects are in the Senate. And, essentially she said it's too early to tell or to say, what the prospects of that bill might be in the Senate. One, because when I talked to her, and this was I think on Wednesday, we hadn't seen a bill yet. So, it was unclear, at least from the Senate perspective, exactly what House Republicans were going to put forward. It sounds like, again, from talking to Bobby Kaufman, that it's going to be very similar to the bill last year, which would be a 5-year moratorium on issuing new casino licenses in the state. So that would be through June 30th of 2030. And then after that, going forward, it would spell out criteria that the Iowa Racing and Gaming Commission would use to consider future casinos, including whether and how much it would drain revenues from existing gambling facilities in Iowa. And so, again, Senator Sinclair said, absent seeing a bill, it's, hard to make any predictions. And again, nothing had been introduced in the Senate. Representative Kaufman, when I asked him about that, said that he was still working to find a partner in the Senate to help run that bill or introduce a companion bill. So I guess we will see. It's anticipated that bill will pass the House again, and I think that. I don't think anything in the House, has materially changed on that issue. I think that, you'll still see bipartisan support for that. It's not an issue that cuts evenly along party lines. It's more a district issue, depending on the lawmaker and whether they have a casino in their district. And there are plenty of Democrats that have casinos in their district that are concerned about the, revenue impacts to their facilities and how that impacts local governments that rely on gaming taxes and local nonprofits that receive donations from casinos.
Yeah, Sarah and Jared, forgive me, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm just curious, do you all hear about this from your local legislatures? And you've both got casinos in your coverage areas, and I'm wondering if this, does this come up at legislative forums that you cover? Do legislators bring it up whenever you talk about it? I'm curious how, if this ever is on your local folks' radar.
Yeah, well, I guess Bobby Kaufman, his district represents like a little sliver of Scott County. So But, talking to lawmakers here ahead of the session on like what their top priorities were, none of them mentioned a casino bill. And in forums, I can't remember the topic coming up recently. Not to say that, local casino groups are not, privately reaching out to the
Sure.
lawmakers. And I know, from your coverage, Tom, like some Davenport city officials went to the Racing Gaming Commission and, advocated against the Cedar Rapids casino. So yeah, so I haven't talked with our local legislators specifically about that, but there, is opposition in our area to, a casino in Cedar Rapids.
Okay.
Yeah, even though there's multiple casinos in our coverage area, it is not something that I've heard legislators bring up in any forums that I've covered or when I do the rundown of talking to them about top priorities. So
yeah, that's interesting. All right. Well, we'll probably have that one to talk about again next week too, depending on assuming that subcommittee gets held, and see how that goes, and maybe we'll have a better answer. See if some of the casino groups are represented there. All right. Finally, this week, we need to put a bow on a story that we tracked early in its life. Iowa Republican U.S. Senator Joni Ernst had been non-committal about whether she will vote to nominate Pete Hegseth, who is President-elect Donald Trump's pick to lead the U.S. Department of Defense. Hegseth is a veteran and former Fox News personality who in the past was said women should not be allowed to serve in the military, and he also faced allegations that he sexually assaulted a woman in California. Hegseth denies those allegations and no charges were filed. Meantime, related to those two things, Ernst is the first female combat veteran to serve in the U.S. Senate, and she is also a sexual assault survivor. So again, she had not pledged one way or the other on how she was going to vote on Pete Hegseth's nomination. Despite those potential issues, Ernst this week said that she will vote to approve his nomination. Todd, let me ask you, and a cynic might point out here that Ernst will face a primary challenge should she run for another term in the Senate, which we expect that she will. She already has one announced primary challenger, and another one could be swinging by soon. Carrie Lake, the unsuccessful candidate for governor in U.S. Senate in Arizona, is coming to an Iowa for an event, and she has Iowa ties and might be looking at moving back here in a Senate run. Is it unfair, Todd, to ask if Ernst's vote to confirm Hegseth is in any way related to her desire to remain in good graces with the voters who support President Donald Trump, and that she might have been persuaded to, or that those voters may have been persuaded to vote against Ernst in a primary had she not supported Hegseth?
Well, I think it's clear that the hell she caught for even suggesting that she might want to watch the process play out was swift and harsh. And so, I think that definitely, to say that didn't have a bearing on it is probably too much to believe. I think she saw what happened and decided that she needed that this, Hegseth is maybe going to be confirmed anyway. But, so she's going to fall in line. She said yesterday she'd support him. But, I think Joni Ernst was probably going to get a primary of sorts anyway. I mean, you look at when Chuck Grassley had a primary, and then Marionette Miller Meeks this last go around, they both had opponents more conservative than themselves who, received a pretty good chunk of votes. So, I mean, Grassley's challenger got like 30% or something like that. So there is that wing of the party out there that doesn't like anyone that, looks the least bit weak, who might not, support someone who's going to restore lethality to the what were the words that he kept using? Lethality and the another name for a soldier, or the war fighter,
the fighting force.
The lethality of the war fighter must be. So it's, I think she'd get a primary anyway. I think this will blow.
Good point.
She'll probably carry enough of Trump's water to, maybe earn his endorsement and not run afoul. But because she hasn't yet. There have been instances where you think maybe she would, and the Hegseth nomination would definitely be somewhere that you would think, all things remaining normal, that she would resist, because this guy pretty much, represents a military that she doesn't recognize, without women in combat and all of that sort of manly machismo stuff that we're getting from him. So, I think she'll probably be able to get reelected if she chooses to run, and she'll be pestered by someone from the right, but I don't think it's going to amount to her defeat.
I would say, though, a challenge to her would be a little bit different than a challenge to Grassley, just because Grassley obviously is much more of an institution in the state. I know, Ernst is a multi-incumbent, but that was much more of an uphill slog, I think, for Jim Carlin than it might be for someone challenging Ernst this time around.
Yeah, well, and the bottom line is, a lot of times you want to hold the Senate seat. And if you go ahead and nominate someone who will be, unpalatable to the general election electorate, even in Iowa, you resist doing that, and you go with the proven candidate. And I think that's why Ernst probably has a pretty solid advantage.
Yeah, I mean, and there may have been, Todd helped me as I work myself through this. Were there any general election considerations here too, politically speaking? Because, I don't know how serious a challenge Democrats are going to be able to amount to her, assuming she runs again. But, it'll be a midterm year. It'll be in a year that's not historically good for the incumbent party, which will be hers. And you've got this of what I think is one of the most intriguing questions going into 2026, which is what happens to all those people who in these past few cycles have come out because solely of Donald Trump. And Republicans obviously have benefited from them greatly, in few states more so than Iowa. And here is now our first election in a, forgive the phrase, a post-Trump on the ballot universe. So she, is she trying to keep some of those folks on the line and giving them a reason to come out for her when Donald Trump won't be on the ballot? Or am I overthinking this?
Well, it's 2026. I mean, Democrats are going to be, if they're smart, they're going to be laser focused on the governor's race. I would doubt the National Party throws many resources into a race against Ernst.
That's a good point.
That's something I was going to say. The Democrats have a number of other seats they need to defend in 2026. The map is not good for them at all. So the National Party is not going to do what they would think is pissing away money in a state that went, plus 16 for Trump, something
13,
like that.
16, somewhere in that range. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Well, and the Franken race sort of burned them too, because they thought they had a chance there and actually put some money into it, and then it turned out they didn't have a chance. So
yeah.
I mean, I was not completely written off by National Democrats, but it's about as close as you can come without being totally written off.
Until they get the caucuses back. But that'll be for another episode of On Iowa Politics.
Look at that transition.
That's it for this episode, folks. We appreciate you joining us. As always, if you're not already, please subscribe to us on your streaming service of choice. We're also on YouTube, where you should also smash that like button. Just think, if you were only listening to this and weren't watching on YouTube, you had no idea that Sarah Watson suddenly appeared to us a few minutes into the podcast. Think of all the things you missed. So check us out on YouTube as well. And as always, you can help us with the click counts too, and find the podcast each week on your preferred Gazette or Lee newspaper website. Now that you've listened to the On Iowa Politics podcast, make sure you're also subscribed to the On Iowa Politics newsletter, where every morning in your inbox, you'll receive all the latest politics and government coverage from our team. You can subscribe to that free newsletter at the Gazette's website, thegazette.com. And again, it's session season. That thing is chock full of news every day. Lastly, don't forget that the work of everyone you heard here today can be found on the pages and websites of the Quad City Times, Muscatine Journal, Cedar Rapids Gazette, Waterloo Cedar Falls Courier, Mason City Globe Gazette, Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, and the Sioux City Journal. For Tom Barton, Maya Marchel Hoff, Sarah Watson, Jared McNett, Todd Dorman, and our guest producer, Becky Gardner, I'm Erin Murphy, and in honor of you, folks, we are going to get up, get out of here, and we're gone. RAPU. Thanks for joining us, everyone.